Phantom rides. The name alone evokes something mysterious, perhaps even frightening. Indeed, these films take their name from the fact that they are photographed from the perspective of an unseen traveler or vehicle, moving through space like a phantom. Perhaps these films reveal the spirit of the camera, of the all-seeing eye that records with neither compassion nor cruelty, but rather cold objectivity. They represent the earliest entry into the world of the omnipresent camera, which now observes and records every facet of our daily lives. Our public and private spaces have become the domain of the camera's eye, and what better way to explore that space than by moving the camera through it? Upon repeated viewings, it becomes clear that they contain an astonishing amount of information just waiting to be deciphered and decoded, as if the filmmakers were speaking to us through time and space itself. While under house arrest, I have had a great deal of time to watch and think about these films. It seemed quite appropriate then that I received a call from the Ministry of Communication with a special assignment, one that would send me down a rabbit hole as circuitous and labyrinthine as any phantom ride.
Kevin Quartermain, I have summoned you here today with a mission. As you know, the state decided to spare your life in the belief that you could be of great service to us in matters of media and communication. The time has come to fulfill your obligation to the state, to justify your existence to us by aiding in this investigation. A mysterious video signal of unknown origin and purpose has appeared on the state communication channel. It appeared early this morning, and so far the Ministry of Communication has been unable to locate the origin of the signal, or how the perpetrator has managed to hijack our video feed to broadcast. Our security task force has described it as driving footage. It appears to show someone behind the wheel of a car, driving aimlessly on roads somewhere around the outer perimeter of the state. This matter is of grave concern to the state. Who is this driver? Where are they going and where have they been? What is the purpose of this video? Why are they recording and broadcasting it? When was it recorded? And how did they get access to the state-secure broadcast channel? The leader believes this to be an extreme security risk, and it is imperative that we identify the source of the video, the identity of the driver, and learn the meaning behind the driving footage.
As I began my investigation, I knew that there was only one person I could turn to who would help me be able to make sense of the driving footage: the elusive film collector known only as George Kaplan. Arrested as a fugitive for smuggling illegal films, George had disappeared following his capture by the state and was presumed dead. But he had left behind thousands of hours of video recordings of himself discussing every facet of film history. Thanks to new developments in artificial intelligence, George's videos had been scanned and processed by audiovisual experts with the Underground Film Society, and he had been reanimated in a virtual reality space called the Image Chamber. By entering this space, connected through my VR headset, I could ask George questions, and his AI simulation would formulate responses based on the vast amount of personal data he had left behind. And with the state-of-the-art facial mapping software that had scanned George's video image, combined with the advanced audio scanning that recreated the precise tone and inflection of his voice, it was just like conversing with George in person. Hello, George? Are you there, George?
Kevin, it's great to see you. What brings you to the Image Chamber today?
I've been tasked with an investigation by the state. A mysterious piece of footage has come across my desk that I can only describe as driving footage. I've been tasked with analyzing this footage, of trying to decipher what it could possibly mean, to figure out who's behind it and what the purpose is of this footage.
Isn't it ironic, Kevin? The two of us, former fugitives, the state tracked us for years because of our film collections. They wanted us stopped. They didn't want these movies being passed around. Well, they got our collections and they got us. You're in their hands and I've been placed here in the image chamber. On the upside, I'm where I've always wanted to be, with my movie collection fully immersed. But that does place me in a very precarious and perhaps advantageous position. All I have to do is think, and I can process the entirety of film history. I would love to see these movies that you're talking about.
If you take a look at these films and process them, you could generate some thoughts on this entire investigation that would be most helpful to me.
All right. Pardon me for one moment while I process them. Oh, that's extraordinary. This footage is, on the surface it's so simple, but I can see why you came to the image chamber, because it intersects with so many different points of film history. It's actually quite complicated. I've constructed an essay. I'd like to share it with you. Would you prefer it digitally, or should we be old-fashioned and you want me to send you a hard copy?
Oh, a hard copy, please.
Just like the old days. It's a lot harder to get rid of the physical evidence.
Exactly.
Have you received your copy?
I have. Here it is.
Well, when you show me this footage, what I think is so extraordinary about it is it really goes back to the earliest movies. What's being shown is, in essence, not so different from what Lumiere was filming. This connection between movement, between mechanics, transportation, and cinema. It's all back there in 1896. You see it when the train enters the station. And what I think is really interesting is, mere months later, the Lumiere cameraman is in Venice on a gondola. And one of the first things he thinks of is, what if I put the camera on the gondola? And that's the creation of a new art form, isn't it? Is there anything close to this idea of movement before that shot?
Argue that it was the camera's ability to move that separates it, that distinguishes cinema from photography?
I think you're right about that. It's interesting because the Muybridge experiments are breaking down motion, but keeping the perspective of a photograph, of a painting. But once the frame becomes mobile, becomes untethered, it really becomes something different. Because even if you're in the theater, the stage doesn't move. The information within the frame, within the stage, that changes. It would be like being in a theater that continually moves somewhere else. It was really such a revolutionary concept, moving the camera.
It strikes me from what you're saying that in this way, cinema has the ability to transport in two ways. One is the image that we're seeing, the physical place where the film is being photographed. But the second way is the camera's ability itself to move through that space. So it's to get back to the point about photography, we're not just simply seeing a visual record or representation of that place, but we're moving through it. We're really immersed in that space. Do you see that as being maybe the main innovation here?
You are totally accurate, and what I think is so profound about a movie like the Edison film about passing through a tunnel. It begins with the perspective of a train, and then it cuts, and where the camera is now on the ground, and it films the train coming through the tunnel. I mean, in a sense, it's like a remake. Edison is remaking the Lumiere footage, but he begins by showing the perspective of the train. It's this dialectic between the camera as this sort of vessel, this sort of medium, and then cut to, well, now you're seeing the documentation of what the camera was doing.
Could we talk about the question of perspective for a minute in relation to that Edison film?
Oh yes, please. There's so much to talk about.
Do you think that the camera and the viewer are one and the same? Do you think that the viewer takes on the perspective of the camera? Or do you think that there is something else? Could it be the viewer taking on the perspective of a passenger, an unseen passenger, or the viewer even taking on the perspective of the mode of transportation, whether it's a train or a car? I mean, I think these are all different possibilities of how we as an audience identify with the perspective that we're being presented with in the movie.
Yeah, there's so many potential perspectives of these films, and I think even the name Phantom Ride gives two really interesting ideas. One is phantom. Is this a ghost? Is there something uncanny? Is there something unhuman about this perspective? Ride, of course, it conveys the action, this sense of movement, but is it a rider, or is it the creation of the ride? Is the perspective that of a passenger? I think what's also interesting about those early movies is it's adopting a very unhuman perspective, because you are now seeing what the train would see, and it's this idea, a train doesn't have an eye, train doesn't have a brain. It's sort of this fusion of man and machine, and it's almost the idea that that these machines are creating art themselves, that they have a perspective, and really thinking about whether it's Fritz Lang in Metropolis, or certain types of industrial music, to what extent is art trying to imitate machinery, mechanization, trying to understand through their own vocabulary what a machine is seeing, hearing, experiencing, and creating.
It does get back to the idea of the mass reproducibility of the image too, and thinking about Vertov's idea of the camera eye, and the sort of the blending of the viewer, the filmmaker, and the camera itself as a kind of all-seeing shared perspective. I think about Andy Warhol's expressed desire to be a machine, and to his approach to art and the reproducibility of much of it. I remember in an interview he said, Warhol said, that his preference for cinema came from the fact that it was easier than painting. He was asked why he began making movies, and he said it's easier. You can just press a button and walk away. And while I think he was being somewhat provocative in saying it that way, he does get at a basic truth of this, which is the fact that this is an image that is not created by the hand of an artist, a painter, for example, but by a machine. And I think as moviegoers, seeing the image recorded by a machine and projected by a machine, we can't help but take on that perspective of the machine.
I think what's so interesting about this driver's footage is that any perspective is a transgression. That perspective is not supposed to exist under the state when no personal cameras are to be allowed. And so it begs the question, what is being seen here? Like, what is the focus? A Phantom Ride film is about this journey. It's not even about the destination. It's about the notion of riding. You think about the film in Indochina.
Oh, the Lumiere film, yeah.
Yes, from 1900. The camera's in a rickshaw. The camera's looking backwards, though. You don't see where it's going. So how can it be a film about a destination if you're not seeing where you're going? You're only seeing where you've been. Shortly thereafter, the film, Before the Fire on Market Street. The camera's moving, again, has adopted the perspective of a train, a streetcar, and it's moving forward, and you can see in the distance a building. The question, though, is that the destination? Could it be going beyond, the building at some point? Is the destination not even captured on film? With the driver's footage, that creates a lot of anxiety. The state is wondering, well, where is the driver going? Where is it ultimately going to end up? Where is it going to land? And the absence of any sort of closure or conclusion or objective creates all these questions.
And perhaps that's what the state finds dangerous, is that if you think about the destruction, if you look at that Market Street footage as an example and think about the destruction that happened just a few days later, it's almost that by looking at this footage of the state, of the boundaries of the state, it's, what could happen to those landscapes just a few days after they're photographed.
That's a very good point, and it makes me think about city symphonies in that they're often seen as odes to modernity, an ode to the city. But, looked at from another perspective, perhaps there's something, if not sinister, at least apprehensive. City symphonies are created because of the rhythms of the city, because of the angles of the architecture. The camera is trying to capture the skyscrapers, the height of the buildings. It's trying to understand, the difference between the street and the sky. It's trying to understand the speed of pedestrian traffic, of automobiles. It's trying to understand, sort of the music, the visual music of trains, of gears, of engines. And the film itself is edited according to all of these elements. So at the end, that's why it's called a city symphony, because it has essentially recreated the manifold aspects of the city through celluloid.
Let me just say, I think you bring up a really good point about this, about the city symphony being, commonly seen as an ode to the city, but I think you're right that there is often a kind of skepticism about modernity as well. And just quickly, I think about the Robert Flaherty film, $24 Island, which does seem to take a somewhat skeptical view of the idea of modernity as progress, and kind of contrasting the idea of uh, the island of Manhattan before it was colonized, before it was developed, and contrasting that as a sort of you know kind of an ideal before the the ground was churned up. We see the steam shovels and the skyscrapers and everything. So I do think that there is perhaps a bit more of a critical sensibility there as well, that's often missed in the city symphonies. Even Skyscraper Symphony by Robert Florey, I think there is the way that those buildings, the height, the sheer height of them, almost intrude on the natural sky, on nature itself.
Oh, you're very right, and I'm also thinking of two other films, T.A. Pennebaker's Daybreak Express, which begins with this sort of like apocalyptic glow as people, cram onto the subway and traverse, through Manhattan. Is this showing a utopia or is this a dystopia? I think it could be either. These people are trapped by, modernity. The tracking shots alongside the subway aren't showing any sort of freedom. It's actually showing, the confines of the environment. The day begins and ends the same, with a huge crowd of people coming onto the train, coming off. It's this almost sort of, Sisyphus-like existence. And then I think of Jeffrey Jones's Rail, which contrasts the steam engine versus an electric train. It's about the passing of one technology onto the other, and within that is not only a sense of mourning for the past, but I think there's a prediction that this electric train too is going to pass someday.
We're viewing it now through the lens of the past, whereas the you know audiences at the time, it was very much the immediate present, very very contemporary, and so I think that in some ways our perspective can take on the uh, this lens of, if not a nostalgic lens, at least a view of seeing it as kind of looking into the past, a detached perspective, that in some ways I think overlooks some of these uncertainties that and these tensions and anxieties that were there for the people making the films. And I think you're right to question whether or not there was a slightly dystopian element in some of those perspectives.
Kevin, you raise a lot of really interesting points, and I think you hit on what the state is afraid of, which is this ambiguity. Is the driver filming a landscape? Is it trying to document the scope of the state's control? Or is he creating a map? Is what he is filming intentional? The other question I think we should discuss is, does the driver understand the importance of what he is filming?
Yeah, I think that's really that it really is kind of the key here in trying to understand what the purpose is behind this, because my question of who is this driver? I mean, we speculate: is he a fugitive on the run from the state? Could he be someone trying to create a documentary record of the present for the future? Is it possibly trying to create a record to look back on with some sort of affection and nostalgia? Perhaps the way we look back at city symphonies, showing these places of an earlier time.
I think this notion of the spy is really quite fascinating, because the city symphony, as much as it is a portrait it's also a deconstruction of the city. It's showing the machines. It's showing the streets. It's showing the people. It's showing how, transportation. On one hand, that is, sort of a hymn to the way the city runs. But on the other hand, somebody could take that information and use it in a subversive way. It's the city symphony creates a portrait of the city, but it also creates the possibility of uncreating the city, of tearing it apart.
I think you're right that the possibility of the footage being used to kind of create a sort of to create a matrix of the layout of the city, to reveal both its points of strength and its points of weakness, could be used in a subversive way. I'm reminded of how in the period following things like the 9/11 terror attacks, there was this concern about photographing city infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, buildings, because of how that could provide a kind of a framework for potential future attacks. It was sort of revealing the vulnerabilities, the potential vulnerable spots of a city where it could be hit. And you're right in this sense that it's not merely documenting it, but it could be also seen as having a nefarious purpose.
I also think we should consider this in a religious context. Religions often have rules for how their deities can be depicted, or whether they're even allowed to be depicted. And you have to think about, well, why? And I think part of it is to depict something is to define it, to give it form. By giving it form, it loses some of its mystery, and by losing mystery, it loses some of its power and influence. I think what the state is very afraid of by this footage is, by filming the landscape, by filming the terrain, the driver is defining the world around him. He's showing this is the world created and owned by the state. And once it's defined and outlined, there then is the possibility of vulnerabilities. If it can be defined, it can be undefined. If it can be located, it can be dislocated.
So you think in some ways that this is as much the state wanting to have control over our very understanding of the physical space itself?
Exactly. If you think about Foucault in the Panopticon, the idea that people are prisoners and that you never know if you're being watched. That's part of why the state doesn't want anyone else to have cameras, because the state wants to be the only one who could be watching you. Now that the driver has a camera, somebody else is watching the state. Somebody else is not only watching the state, but other people. It really decentralizes the state's power. This is a direct challenge to their authority.
Do you think in a similar way that the earliest films, I mean, whether we're talking about Phantom Rides or other actualities, do you think that they had a similar effect of breaking down boundaries of how audiences saw the world? People who perhaps never had traveled even beyond their hometown, let alone to another country, were suddenly immersed in environments on the other side of the world. Do you think that there was perhaps a similar destabilizing effect as a result of that?
Oh, most definitely. Rebecca Solnit writes about this in her essay, The Annihilation of Time and Space, um, where in the 19th century, that's especially at the end of the 19th century, you have the invention of cinema, of photography, telegraph, trains. There were revolutions in geology that changed how old we thought the world was. Um, People for a very long time were defined by, where they could walk. And then she makes the point that, well, if you can control nature, whether, an animal, if you can tame it, if you can convince it to pull a cart, you can get a little bit further. Um, these technologies superseded what man and nature could do. It could take you further and faster than we could, on our own or with the help of animals. And the photographic image meant that you didn't even have to physically go somewhere to be transported. That, you could still be in one place and you could now see the rest of the world. It's really a revolutionary, mind-blowing, change of understanding of the entire world that happened in the span of a couple decades.
I remember Solnit in that essay talking about the idea too of how the perception of the landscapes themselves was altered by the speed of transportation of the train, and that the landscapes almost descended into a kind of blur, an indecipherable blur, when seen from the from the window of a train, as opposed to passing through them, in say a horse and cart, and how that had to have had a significant impact on our relationship to landscapes, and also just the speed from which you could move from one place to another. I mean, that was completely unprecedented in the human experience, the human perspective.
What I think is really interesting about a film like The Georgetown Loop is that it really highlights, this sort of conflict between, nature and technology, because you get this incredible vista of the West, but you see the telegraph wires, you see, the train tracks, you can see the train itself, navigating. Um, and you don't get the same sense when you're seeing like a city portrait where you're seeing mainly buildings and people, and there's a little bit of you know sense of, if not domestication, at least civilization. But to see the stark contrast between raw mechanics and raw nature, like in the Georgetown Loop, it really highlights um, this difference.
It's interesting, speaking of that particular film, too, to think about an added layer of the manipulation of that image when Ken Jacobs used it as the basis of of an experimental film in which he kind of filtered it and sort of reflected and doubled the image, kind of creating a mirroring effect of it. Because again, we have this natural landscape that's been filtered once through the mechanical process of cinematography, and then being further manipulated. And it's interesting how through that film of Ken Jacobs' kind of reimagining of the Georgetown loop using that footage, it calls us back to question how the camera is manipulating what it is we're seeing, whether that's because of visual effects or whether that's just simply through the choice of the shot, the choice of subject. Again, getting back to this point of perspective, it all comes back to the perspective.
I think we should consider another early Phantom Ride film, Georges Méliès's panorama from the top of a moving train. Because we typically think of Méliès as the counterpoint to Lumière. Méliès was the magician, he was the illusionist. And yet this is seemingly an actualité. Though I think we should think about the movie not in terms of documentary or nonfiction, but in terms of his later films. It begins with a train passing underneath a bridge. It's almost an entirely black screen as the film begins, and as the train emerges, light. I mean, it really seems as if it's a curtain being pulled back on stage, or in terms of cinema, the projector being turned on and that bright blast of light hitting the center of the screen and illuminating everything. To what extent are these Phantom Ride films theatrical experiences? Is it intended to be a documentary, or is it supposed to be a thrill? Is it supposed to be something more akin to science fiction, or perhaps a magic show? To what extent is there an illusion? Méliès was always attracted to trick photography, and certainly the notion of the mobile camera was a trick at the time. So if Méliès was able to locate a sense of illusion in the actuality, Kevin, I think we need to think about what potential for illusion is there in the driver's footage. Do you have any thoughts about whether the driver's footage is in itself an illusion, or is it actuality?
As I've been delving into this, I've even gone so far as to consider whether or not this entire investigation itself is a kind of illusion. That perhaps this is a way of the state, throwing me and throwing others off the track of some kind of greater surveillance program by making this cursory effort to investigate this signal. But perhaps this is all just a distraction from some sort of greater surveillance. Again, what we're not seeing could be the real threat here. I think one of the things to look at in this is the question of time, right? Whether or not we're looking at a live feed or a pre-recorded loop. Either way, what we'd be seeing on the screen is the same at a surface level, but I think the question of whether or not what we're seeing has the immediacy of live footage, or whether it's a pre-recorded piece. Again, who can say? I've been thinking about trying to decipher small details in it as well. One of the theories I have is that there could be some sort of a message encrypted in the visual, clues themselves. But so far, I've been unable to find anything that could be interpreted that way.
Perhaps the message is not in what's being depicted, but what's not being depicted. As you suggested, this might be a loop. If it were a loop, think about how these sorts of shots are used in movies. Loops are done to circumvent security cameras. They're used as a distraction. Is the driver distracting us from something else? Is what we're seeing what we're not supposed to be seeing?
That's a good point. One of the theories that I had been mulling over was whether or not that this footage could be the work of perhaps a rogue agent working for the state, trying to disseminate some kind of message to the public, or possibly to another individual, similar to what you're suggesting about the way that surveillance monitors can be thrown off using being fed a pre-recorded loop. it kind of raises the question for me about whether or not this is a method of effectively of signal jamming the state communication channel to either convey some sort of a signal to somebody, perhaps an agent in the field, or perhaps to prevent the state from being able to communicate. And in thinking about all this, I keep coming back to this question of the perspective of the driver. I'm reminded of a distinction that I read in an interview, I believe it was, with Jonas Mekas, and he was talking about the distinction between being a filmmaker and a filmer. And I think his distinction was that a filmmaker is choosing what to photograph, placing things in front of the camera, and making all of these choices. Whereas a filmer is more of a passive observer, recording whatever happens to pass in front of the camera.
What's confusing to the state, and I think what causes them anxiety, is exactly what you're talking about. Is the purpose of this footage what's depicted, or is it the act of filming this footage that is the point? Because both of those is going to change the entire purpose of what this footage is. Is it to inspire others to be documenting, or is it perhaps inspiring others to flee? Is the driver perhaps, instead of being pursued, are they in pursuit of something? Is that what's causing the state anxiety? The fact that he might be getting closer to something or somewhere that they don't want him to get to.
Relating this back to the Phantom Ride, something that I find interesting about so many of those that I've seen is the sense of aimlessness of the ride being depicted. We were talking about in the trip down Market Street about this building that we see at the end of the street, and whether or not that even is the destination. Where are we going? Why are we on this ride? And I think that is something that is subversive about the Phantom Ride film. And it's interesting to think about in later Hollywood movies. If you think about the role of back projection, in driving scenes or scenes where characters are riding in a train or some other mode of transportation, that there's always these passing backgrounds behind the actors to create that sense of movement, of travel. And what I find interesting is that the Phantom Ride is completely devoid of any sort of characters, any kind of apparent motivation, any kind of narrative purpose. And isn't it interesting that once, when Hollywood films began to tell stories and began to feature characters and to showcase stars, isn't it interesting how the Phantom Ride film actually lives on in those movies, but always in the background, always as a kind of a second thought, a secondary, like a piece of the set dressing almost, something that we don't even really pay attention to.
No, you're actually right. They continue to haunt, filmmaking practices for decades to come, and I think they continue to haunt this, what we call the dash cam footage today. I'm reminded of Joseph Lewis's Gun Crazy, which I think is a really pivotal moment between the transition from the so-called Phantom Ride rear projection to something that's a little bit more immersive, but still holds true to the initial thrill of the Phantom Ride, which is the experience. In Gun Crazy, the heist sequence is done in one take. The camera is between the passenger and driver's seat, but the center of the frame is the windshield. The driver pulls over, the passenger jumps out and commits the robbery. The camera never cuts, though. It's that integrity of time that creates a sense of suspense, of anticipation. And when the robber gets back in the car, we take off. How different cinematically is that from dash cam footage? We are just watching real time through the world of the windshield.
And there is something slightly subversive about that, because again, we're in using your example of Gun Crazy, there's a fracture. We're divorced for a moment from the identification with the character, and we're made aware of the camera again, where there's this kind of phantom perspective. You know, who are we as the audience at that moment? You know, we've been identifying with the character up to that point, but I think for a minute we're left behind. We're kind of fractured from that identification, and I think that is jarring.
And I think, building off what you're saying, the aspect of duration is key. And I think that's what's so frightening to the state about the driver's footage. There is no cut. It continues to go on, which begs the question of when will it end? What is the goal? What is the destination? What's happening off screen? What robbery is going on? All these questions, I think, are what's unsettling to the state about this footage.
There's something else too. I mean, if we take it even further, I think about the Rendezvous film by Claude Lelouch, and how that depicts, acts of violating the traffic laws. I think about how truly subversive a film like that is, using the act of driving to create this thrill, to kind of create this visceral sense of speeding through the streets, and you have the kind of vicarious experience of flying through red lights and zipping around crowded corners through traffic.
I think what's so interesting about the Lelouch film is the sense of intoxication. It's a thrill. We see pedestrians that we should be identifying with who are jumping back from the sidewalk, throwing themselves against buildings so they don't know what this driver is going to do. This should be a horror film. There's nothing civil, there's nothing thoughtful about what we're seeing, and yet we're intoxicated by it. We want to be the driver. That is our perspective, is of the driver in the car doing these things. So essentially, the film is making us the transgressor. We are breaking the laws. We're not just watching it happen, we are doing it. And I think that's what's so frightening about this footage of the driver. We're not seeing somebody drive. We are doing the driving ourselves. The state doesn't want us to identify with that person at all.
Thinking about the Lelouch film, one of the things I was reminded of in watching it is, what we hear about how things like social media challenges, in which people will steal cars, take them for joyrides, speeding around the streets until they crash and total the cars. It reminded me of another question related to perspective that I want to ask you about, which is the distancing effect of the camera, the kind of the way that by telling ourselves, oh, this is only a movie, it's only it's being recorded, it's performative, that creates a kind of distancing effect when it comes to committing these illegal acts and perhaps in some ways justifying these illegal acts.
Yeah, and in a certain sense, it entirely does what you're talking about. The potential for narrative changes how one understands their own actions. Cinema, uh, has long rewarded daredevils, people who transgress laws, who put their own lives and others at risk. Those are the heroes. Um, think about the Lelouch film for a moment. He's an artist. He's a performer. He's a driver. The racetrack is a stage. People are in the audience. Lelouch's film disintegrates the divide between the stage and the audience. The driver is now in the world of the audience. And in the case of this film, we become the performer. We get the thrill of actually doing these, risky, dangerous, highly illegal activities. And you can see, the people that he passes by are scared to death, and yet the film presents him as a hero. At the end, he gets the girl. He gets the girl, and they walk away, and not into the sunset, but off camera. There's no repercussion for anything, and you can see that in these videos of TikTok challenges of people stealing cars. They see themselves as the star of this film. You can see it, people drag racing. There are other cars around them. There are pedestrians around them, and yet the drivers don't see that. They see themselves as the star of the narrative.
It's interesting, too, how that narrative, in the case of the Lelouch film specifically, is used to kind of resolve everything that we've seen, to alleviate questions of the legal responsibilities of what the driver has been doing. It kind of wraps it up in a neat, tidy way that I think in a lot of ways, like I said, kind of absolves him of all these questionable acts that have been caught on camera.
And I think that's what the state is so afraid of. The driver is continuing to drive. There's no resolution. He's not caught. He's not, jailed. His camera is not taken away from him. The very existence of this footage, and the longer that it goes on, just adds to the danger that he presents to the state. He can do this. If he can do it, others can too.
It is interesting, though, in looking at the driving footage, that our driver doesn't seem to be violating any traffic laws. In fact, he seems to be going out of his way to avoid anything that might, catch the attention of the police. It seems to be, which I think it adds to the state's confusion over this, because there's not even a clear subversive purpose or act of illegality that they can point to in order to bring this driver down. There's almost something kind of maddening about the very blandness of this act of just driving around and around and around.
Kevin, you have answered your own question. That is what is subversive about it. He's not calling attention to himself. The driver is driving like everyone else. He's able to fit in. And yet, he's not fitting in because he's not following the rules. If other people can start doing what he does, there's going to be a big problem for the state.
Do you think that there's a possibility that this driver could be trying to lead people in a revolution of sorts to explore the boundaries of their world beyond the screens, beyond the isolation that we've been forced into? Do you think that this could be seen as a act of breaking out of these kinds of virtual limitations? You know, because I think about something as we were talking about gun crazy, and thinking about the camera taking the perspective. I mean, the viewer taking the perspective of the camera. If you think about how there's been almost this direct lineage from that to, you know, films like Vertigo, and how Hitchcock, you know, has the camera driving around the streets of San Francisco, and if you follow this all the way up to the things like first-person video games, to virtual reality, to the kind of you know, virtual spaces made possible through technology like the metaverse, and this idea of effectively living your entire life in a virtual space, similar to how we are right now in the image chamber. There seems to be this lineage from the Phantom Ride to that. Do you think in some ways that this driver could be using the form of the Phantom Ride to rebel against it, to rebel against how it's encroached on our day-to-day reality?
I absolutely. This is a modern manifest destiny. I think of again sort of a precursor to the dash cam, Betty Gordon and James Benning's The United States of America, a film that is almost entirely adopting the perspective from Gun Crazy. It's the camera's hovered between the passenger and the driver's seat. They don't say a word. They go coast to coast in the U.S. Again, it's sort of this, you know, manifest destiny, this westward ho, this, you know, into the frontier. And, you know, what I find so fascinating about that film is there are these crossfades from one moment you see an urban metropolis, you see skyscrapers and buildings and alleys. The next you see, you know, it's, you know, the trees all around. And the next you see these vast expanses of highways. You see, you know, these exits, and yet the car never takes an exit. It just keeps going until it hits the ocean. And like at the Lelouch film, the driver gets out, and in this case, so does the passenger. The film stops. You see them leave, but you don't know where they're going. And I think there's a couple possibilities. I think one is that this isn't the end of the journey. It's the end of the literal road for these people, because there's no more road for them to go on. But that doesn't mean that they can't go somewhere on foot, that they can't, maybe they get on a boat, maybe they swim, maybe they fly. We don't know. And I think about the driver's footage. It's the same sense of possibilities. You know, possibilities are what scares the state. You know, where is he going? He doesn't know. He doesn't stop. But the further he goes, the more possibilities for places to go there are.
Well, George, thank you for sharing all of your thoughts on this. It's given me a lot to think about. It's obviously a lot to mull over and to process here as I prepare my final report, but I think my time here in the image chamber is about to come to an end, as I need to get back to my investigation and prepare my final statements to present to the Minister of Communication on this matter. But it's been great seeing you again.
Kevin, it's always wonderful to talk movies with you. Thank you for coming to the Image Chamber. Maybe sometime you'd like to stay here longer, be a permanent member of the Image Chamber. It's not really such a bad life, being immersed in the movies forever.
I'm not dead yet. As I prepare my final report for the Minister of Communication, I realize that I am no closer to solving the questions about the origin and purpose of the driving footage. The footage has inspired so many ideas and possibilities that play over like a million video loops inside my mind. There is one other possibility that I've considered, that the person behind the driving footage is none other than George Kaplan, and that he knew the video and its subsequent broadcast would precipitate my investigation. He certainly knew of my interest in the Phantom Ride films, so perhaps the purpose of the driving footage has been this very inquiry itself, giving me something to occupy my mind during house arrest. Maybe George is still out there after all. Or perhaps the AI simulation has become so advanced that he has effectively been reborn in the image chamber. For now, I should perhaps leave the final word on the subject to George Kaplan, wherever he may be, whether behind the projector in an underground film society somewhere, or in the eternal visual simulation of the image chamber. For it may take an eternity to begin to understand the origin and the meaning of these images.
The Metaphysical Mysteries of Phantom Ride Films by Dr. George Kaplan, State Film Archivist. A driver. The driver, let's call him, drives. The dashboard camera records movement. The footage is broadcast. The event has made the state afraid. Why? The answer can be found at the birth of cinema itself. Cinema, movement, transportation. The camera and the vehicle are mechanical lovers. Their fates intertwined. Think back to the Lumiere brothers in their first film, The Train Entering the Station. History favors the legend of how the audience thought the train was going to crash through the screen and into the audience. Perhaps it is apocryphal, perhaps there is a grain of truth. But what is more important is not the relationship of the audience to the screen, but between the camera and the train. The edges of the frame demarcated the end of the world, the limits of existence, and the train somehow went beyond it. What happened to the train once it passed by the edge of the frame? Did it continue to exist? And if it did, where did it go? The Lumiere film is, at its core, a mystery as much as it is a marvel. Such metaphysical queries even piqued the curiosity of Maxim Gorky, who remarked of a Lumiere street scene, "All the moves teems with life, and upon approaching the edges of the screen, vanishes somewhere beyond it." The Lumiere brothers soon began to investigate the metaphysical realm of cinema, probing into the borders of reality, the limits of existence, proposed by their very first film. Later that same year, their cameraman, Alexander Promio, was in Venice. Inspired by a gondola ride, he brought a camera with him. Panorama of the Grand Canal, Venice, from 1896, is the precursor to the Phantom Ride film. The gondola is hidden from view. The camera glides along the river like a wraith, unable to leave the earthly plane, whose unfulfilled vengeance tethers it to our reality. Or, perhaps like a sea monster, rising from the sea, gazing upon the intruders into its realm. Within a year, the Lumieres and their cameramen had moved beyond the limits of the horizontal perspective of the Grand Canal. By changing the camera angle, they changed the content of their inquiry. In 1897's panorama taken from a rickshaw in Indochina, Nemo Village, the camera is pulled by the rickshaw, and it looks backwards as children chase after it. No longer is the camera defining the limits of the world. Instead, the mobile camera is constantly changing, constantly expanding the limits of the world as we know it. Movement, rather than the subject, has become the creator. Movement is the artist, movement is the medium. In Grand Canal and Nemo Village, the Lumieres seem to ask, what does the movement mean? Clearly the camera is going somewhere, but its gaze is not on the future but the past. The camera watches where it has been. Once again, there's another mystery of the metaphysical variety. The world only exists in retrospection. The world exists only where the camera has come and gone. Where the camera is going is unknown, unseen, untraveled, unmoved. And the children, are they chasing the camera, or perhaps are they joining it? Has it inspired them? Is the camera leading the way to liberation? Is this what the state fears from the driver, that he too might inspire others to follow him? A decade later, the Miles brothers in San Francisco were investigating the metaphysics of camera movement. In a trip down Market Street before the fire from 1906, the camera no longer looks behind. It's instead pointed ahead, to the future. But what future? To the building in the distance, or a destination before or beyond? Whereas the Lumiere Nemo Village films showed where we had been, here the Miles brothers leave the motivation unanswered. Is the camera running? Is it being chased? Or is it chasing something? Is it the pursued or the pursuer? Nothing can deter the camera. Cars, horses, people. They all dart in front of the camera, but the camera never wavers in its path. Nor does it show any interest in anyone else. It is stubborn, obstinate, determined. Consider the mobile frame, changing every fraction of a second, instantly forgetting what has come before. There is no permanence to what has been filmed. Once it has passed through the projector, it is gone, perhaps forever. This city, San Francisco, is destroyed, frame by frame, filmed into oblivion. Perhaps this is what the state fears. That which the driver has passed thus becomes part of the past, and not of the future. That which the driver has passed has been forgotten. In G.W. Bitzer's New York subway from 1905, the camera traverses the subway from 14th Street to 42nd Street. But unlike in Nemo Village or Market Street, Bitzer doesn't adopt the perspective of a passenger. Instead, he manifests the view of the subway train itself. In doing so, Bitzer reveals a vision of the city that the state never intended to be shown, the hidden inner workings of the metropolis. Consider the patterns of light, bouncing off beams, casting shadows that resemble a ribcage. If the subway tunnel is like the body, then the camera is like a parasite, a cancer, that travels where it is unnatural, seeing what it should not see, being where it is not wanted. And if the camera is indeed a cancer, then it has the power to kill. Perhaps this is what the state fears, that the driver too could be a cancer. What makes New York subway so unique is its reflexivity. It belongs to a select breed of phantom ride films that not only manifests the movement, but also shows the vessel. Here, the camera takes the perspective of the subway train, but it also follows a subway train. Like a mirror, we see in front of the camera that which the camera ultimately represents. When the front train stops to let on passengers, the camera becomes a crystal ball, showing its own future. It too will eventually stop for passengers to step on and step off. The camera has not only the power to document the present and to manifest the past, but also to display the future. Perhaps this too is something feared by the state. What does the driver represent if not liberation? And what is his destination if not the future? Each car in front of him represents a potential new timeline. The driver, however, rejects these possibilities, choosing to continue driving. The exits and on-ramps map out a future that the driver chooses to ignore. Refusal is the ultimate decision. These films are called phantom ride films because the mechanism of movement is hidden. But they are phantoms in another sense too. The camera is both a memento mori of the past and a harbinger of death yet to come. If the camera is indeed a macabre symbol, it is fitting that one of its earliest practitioners was none other than George Méliès, the great artist of the fantastic, the illustrator of illusions. His panorama from top of a moving train from 1898 shows how the line between actuality and fantasy is not so distinct. The film starts with the camera passing under a bridge. With no light, the screen is dark. As the camera moves forward, it enters light, and like a curtain raising, behold, a theater. But if this is theater, we must ask, what is the stage? Who is the audience? Who is the actor? And is there a creator? Perhaps it is these questions which the state does not want us asking of the driver's footage. What theater is he revealing? What stage does the state not want the curtain pulled back upon? Méliès, a great magician himself, must have appreciated the internal magic of the mobile frame, a static camera position that creates the illusion of movement when projected. The camera is steady. It is the foundation upon which it rests that moves. The camera does not create movement, it is the victim of movement. Perhaps this is what the state fears from the driver, a sense of victimhood. The driver moves continually because he must. The camera bears witness to this violence. There is an inherent tension in Phantom Ride films between free will and predestination. Consider the 1897 Scottish film Railway Ride over the Tay Bridge. We see the rails before us, rails that, at that point, were merely decades old, if that, and still very new to many parts of the world. Rails that could take people farther than their legs and faster than their horses. Rails which offered a sense of freedom and mobility like never before. And yet, where is the freedom in a predetermined trail? This is where the drama sets in. In dreams, it is called night paralysis, a sense that one cannot control one's own body. The camera moves forward, and you are powerless to move. Phantom rides are at once a depiction of freedom and entrapment, of movement and restriction, of the boundless and the bounded. Is this at the heart of the driver's footage? A sense of panic? Of endless streets with no opportunity for meaningful, actual escape? The longer the driver's footage continues, the larger the scale of entrapment that he reveals. Perhaps this is what the state fears, the exposure of the true scale of their labyrinth. This sense of entrapment never left the Phantom Ride genre. D.A. Pennebaker's Daybreak Express from 1953 is a portrait of urban prisoners, trapped by a train, trapped by buildings, trapped by alleys, trapped by the city itself. With the apocalyptic orange glow that opens and closes the film, Pennebaker shows the hellscape that life on Earth has already become. It is a work of horror, and its protagonists are urban Sisyphuses, doomed to repeat this travel day in and day out. The tracking shots from the train are documenting the expanse of the prison state, the totality of the state's control. Perhaps this is what the state fears from the driver's movie. He is documenting a new prison state, and for every mile further that he goes, he creates living evidence of the state's oppression. The maze extends beyond the city in Betty Gordon and James Benning's The United States of America from 1975. A coast-to-coast car ride that offers no escape, only more on-ramps, more off-ramps, and more lane changes. The camera, hovered between the back seat and front, left seat and right, gazes out of the window while the driver and passengers sit in silence, nearly motionless except for the turning of the wheel. This perspective anticipates the 21st century dashcam genre, but its roots go back even further to Joseph H. Lewis's Gun Crazy from 1950. The camera sits in the back seat, watching out the front window as Peggy Cummins pulls over for John Dahl to exit and perform a robbery. The camera lingers in the car as the heist is pulled off. We wait in anticipation for his return. When he jumps in the car, Peggy drives off, and we watch as they make a getaway. There is no cut. The single take makes us complicit in the robbery. The ghosts of John and Peggy continue to haunt the United States of America. Perhaps Betty and James's protagonists are John and Peggy, still on the run decades later. This connection to film noir shows how the dashcam genre is inexorably linked to criminality. This is what the state fears, the complicity of duration. While the anonymous drivers crisscross the country, skyscrapers and apartment buildings crossfade to forests in an instant. City gives way to country, gives way to city, and back again to country, linked by a seemingly endless network of concrete roadways. Is not what they are showing the various facades of a pervasive American prison? The horizon is like the prison wall, forever expanding the further they go. And when they reach the beach in the final frames of the film, is this the end of their journey? Is this their destination? Or is it merely the end of the car's journey? Have the passengers left one set of maps in search of another? And is this what the state fears? The moment when the driver will eventually get out of the car and truly get loose, lost in the city. A similar question pervades the ending of Claude Lelouch's C'est un rendezvous from 1976, when the driver gets out of the car to meet a young woman, the date hinted in the film's title. Is this the destination or just another beginning? The film is an 8-minute shot with a camera mounted on the side of a car, a variation on the dash cam concept. As it speeds through Paris, it breaks innumerable traffic laws. Pedestrians jump back against the wall when it passes by. For years, rumors circulated that Lelouch was jailed after the film premiered. Truthfully, he was questioned by the police, but did not serve time. It is yet another connection between the dash cam and criminality, a reminder to the state of what the long take can represent, what it can document, and what it can inspire. This sense of geography, of mapping, is essential to an outgrowth of the Phantom Ride film, The City Symphony. If the Phantom Ride delineates a single ride, a single path, then the City Symphony is the intersection of many such paths, the nexus of manifold geographies. And like Phantom Ride films, the City Symphony hinges on a celebration and a horrification of modernity. Is Robert Flaherty's $24 Island an ode to New York City or an obituary? Like a trader collecting reconnaissance for alien invaders, Flaherty depicts the city's layout, its structures, its technologies, displaying its strengths and perhaps exposing its weaknesses. In Berlin's Symphony of a Great City, does Walter Ruttmann reconstruct or deconstruct the titular city? By locating its seams, he threatens to tear it apart. By locating its rhythms, he threatens to disrupt it, throw it off beat. The City Symphony is, at its heart, a blasphemous genre. If modernity is a god, as the buildings appear to be in Robert Fleury's Skyscraper Symphony, then what does it mean for a filmmaker to depict the gods in such a literal fashion? Some religions forbid the pictorialization of their deities for precisely the reason that to manifest them is to divest them of power. To depict them as human is to rob them of their immortality. The camera brings with it the power to preserve, to archive, but also to destroy, to annihilate. The camera looks on with flattery and with villainy. The state may have created this world, but if the driver can capture it as an image, as a concept, an idea, perhaps he can also capture it in its physical form too. Perhaps this, all of this, is what the state fears from the driver, what it fears from a continuous mobile frame, from a camera shot whose duration offers no hint of cessation, the potential for destruction, for revolution, for rebellion. It lies latent within every frame, and it has since the beginning of cinema. Cinema was born to destroy the world it created on the screen. As long as the driver continues to depict this world, he is destroying what the state created. Thus, he is destroying the state itself.